Greetings. It is a hot 86-degree afternoon in the sanctuary in Bayfield on June 21st. Our readings today, and I will leave you to do the readings, Psalm 86, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, verses 24 to 39, Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 to 21, Jeremiah chapter 20, verses 7 to 13, and the letter to the Romans, chapter 6, verses 1 to 11. During my time in seminary, I discovered the challenges of learning Greek. One odd comment that stuck with me is the comparison of the Greek language with the language of Yoda. Yes, Yoda. Yoda is the ancient sage in the Star Wars film. One of his famous expressions seems to fit with our readings today. "Named must your fear be, before banish it you can," said Yoda. Now you may need to listen to or read that quote a few times in order to untangle it. I'll say it again. "Named must your fear be, before banish it you can." It takes time to untangle the language from Yoda, just as it takes time to untangle our fears. When we become aware of fear, it is possible to name it. In doing this, we begin the process of disabling any power the fear may hold. The passages today speak of fear that is deeply rooted within the cultural context and daily lives of the disciples and prophets. In our faith communities, there can be fear and confusion and unraveling the meaning of discipleship. Some will shrink inwardly when they hear the term. Images of door-to-door canvassing and street corner preaching may be visual images that linger with you. Discipleship can seem like a foreign and strange part of our faith due to these misconceptions. One place to start is to unravel what the word disciple means. But first, there are some questions for you to ponder before we continue. How do you understand your part in being a disciple? How is this evident in your life? How do you observe others living out their sense of being a disciple of Jesus? Sit with these questions for a time and then continue. Here we have the advantage of the printed sermon if it's been emailed to you or if you've pulled it off the internet, or just restarting and stopping and restarting the video. You can pause and reflect and then resume. When we look to a translation of the Greek methetes, we discover that the term disciple refers to a learner or a pupil. Within the context of our Christian faith, disciples are learning to follow in the ways of Christ. This is an important premise of discipleship as we grow in our understanding of being lifelong learners. This passage allows us to explore our curiosity about how Jesus teaches. Two broad questions seem to arise from this passage. What was Jesus teaching the disciples? And what are we to learn from it in the 21st century? You will recall from last week that the disciples were being sent as messengers to the 12 tribes of Israel. They were warned of the ill treatment, suffering, and persecution that they would endure. They are sent out to embody his teachings without his physical presence. They would be sheep among wolves, and the Spirit of God would speak through them. They are also not assured of safe travel. However, they are assured that God would be with them through the challenges and the danger. The disciples were warned of the opposition and struggle they would encounter. They were prepared for the days when they would question, what are we to do when we are not strong enough on our own? Even in times of fear, the gospel story brings strength in its truth. We discover that individual lives, family structures, and the whole of society thrives when the good news is embraced. Jesus prepared his disciples for their mission to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The disciples have courageously left their families and communities to follow him. Now they are being sent out as apostles without him. He gave them authority over unclean spirits and the ability to cure disease and the ill. The disciples were to live simply, carry no supplies, and rely upon hospitality in their travels. Imagine. Jesus describes the stark and realistic challenges that they will face. The passage from Matthew illustrates how Jesus recognized that fear would impact the disciples and how he taught them to deal with that fear. In naming the suffering, Jesus helps the disciples to free themselves from the grip of fear. Do not fear is a primary theme in this passage. They are warned that whatever hardship awaits them, They are warned that whatever hardship awaits the teacher also awaits the disciple. Secrets will be revealed as they continue on their journey. When they spread the good news of the gospel, their simple lifestyle, vulnerability, and dependence on God would demonstrate the reality of God in their life. Jesus addressed the fear of persecution and death when he speaks of those who could only kill the body, not the whole person. Although threat of violence and death are real concerns for the disciples, God alone could destroy both body and soul. Is it not God alone, then, that we should fear? Yet we are not to fear God in the same way that we might fear powerful people and the systemic structures of this world. God knows and cares even for the sparrows that are sold for an assyrion, a small coin equal to the 10th of a drachma, a small amount. God knows even the hairs on our heads better than we do. We tend to think of power as control, as rule, as dominant forces understood in an authoritarian structure. Control and submission are two sides of this structure. Power tends to define relationships by the possession of power or the absence of power. The powerful appear to have knowledge and to be invulnerable, while the powerless are seen as unknowing and vulnerable. Yet, the passage today speaks against such authoritative structures. The power and authority is shared within humanity with the mystery of God. We are encouraged to share our knowledge of how we experience God in our hearts and our souls. Obedience to authority presumes that good order exists within the structure and that such good order is the priority. We have become aware that such structures do not tolerate change very well. The model relies on blindly following rules and directions. It becomes topsy-turvy with the rules and structure that override the needs of humanity and creation. Where do we see evidence of this? We can look in the past decades when tobacco companies purposefully denied the documented impact that cigarette smoke caused harm. Their need for profit trumped care for humanity. More recently, news reports illustrate the devastating impact of emphasizing profit over care for the vulnerable. In the midst of daily reports of high deaths and military intervention in the care of residents, the owners of the private long-term care facilities cite the potential cost of raising provincial regulatory standards. It is anticipated that regulatory standards will be changed to include reasonable care for residents, fair living wages, proper personal protective equipment for staff, and adequate staffing for the needs of the residents. Some owners and investors of the facilities seem to have a higher regard for profit than care for humanity. There are many caring and supportive facilities, However, some have followed an ineffective model that stress corporate profit. Although Jesus called his disciples to be peacemakers, he acknowledges that his mission will not bring peace, but a sword, as long as those in power resist God. Jesus demonstrates that peacemaking may result in violence, yet it will bring healing and restoration. Discipleship places God as the priority and leaves all other claims on us as secondary. The disciples will turn away from the hierarchies that held individuals and groups within an oppressive and brutal structure. In this shift, even family relationships may suffer. The disciples are instructed to identify with people on the margins, the slaves and the rebels. Jesus promised that those who lost their life for him would find it. However, those who found life within the world would ultimately lose their life. It makes sense that the disciples would experience fear and anxiety in this new way of seeing the world. They were to give their fear over to the God who responds with mercy and compassion. Following Jesus had real consequences. They could be shunned by their families for embracing their new faith and their new ways of living. There are countless stories of martyrs, people who suffered or were killed due to their faithful discipleship. There are those who suffered loss of family, social place, financial security, and respectability because they embraced a faith that challenged social structures. Barbara Brown Taylor, theologian and author, reflects on this passage with, quote, "I am a daughter, a wife, a sister, an aunt, and each of these identities has shaped my life, but none of them contains me. I am Barbara, I am a Christian, I am a child of God. That is my true identity, and all the others grow out of it." When we love God above all other loves, we may lose those we love. This does not mean we set aside healthy interdependent relationships. It does mean that we must question our part in relationships that are unhealthy and relationships that do not nurture. Yet we are not to fear. Buried in the demand to love God is the promise that when we lose what we lose for God's sake, we shall find again, return to us more alive than ever before. Jeremiah is able to let go of his fear as he laments and lashes out at God. It can be difficult to listen to someone in pain when they are angry at God. Some people struggle with their anger. In many ways, anger has become a misunderstood emotion. It is as if we are afraid that such anger is profane and blasphemous. A closer look at this passage, however, may reveal a different way of understanding this emotion. Fear and anger are often linked. Anger can arise in a coping behavior to deal with fear. Both are powerful motivators. Jeremiah lived in a time of great social upheaval. In that time, Jeremiah was called to warn Jerusalem that their city could be destroyed. Sharing this message did not make him popular. Jeremiah expressed his grief and anger at God because God had persuaded him to do this task. He faced hostility and rejection when compelled to speak against the actions of Jerusalem. Yet when he stopped speaking the prophetic message, he felt the word of God burn inside of him. Jeremiah seemed to be in a lose-lose situation. Would he find any sense of peace? When we continue in the passage, we discover that once he expressed his anguish, he was filled with praise for God. The prophet struggled with the realities of living his faith in the prophetic message. Yet his anguish, doubt, and anger demonstrate the power of his faith. In the midst of despair and anger, Jeremiah knows the grace of God. Faithful living may bring struggle with God and God's will. This struggle can lead to a deeper understanding of God's love. In his sermon, "You Are Accepted," theologian Paul Tillich wrote that grace strikes us when we are in great pain and restlessness. Grace is most evident when we walk through the dark valley of meaningless and empty life, when despair destroys all joy and courage. Jeremiah's prophetic task takes him to the edge of despair and to the depth of his fear. It is there that he discovers the depth of God's loving grace. In closing, in the letter to the Romans, the book of Jeremiah, and the Gospel of Matthew, we discover encouragement to faithfully live into our identity as followers of Christ. We are called to learn and grow. This growth allows us to responsibly engage in transforming inhumane, systemic injustice. Disciples, listen closely to the context of this teaching. First, to understand and then to take appropriate action. The disciples in Jeremiah experienced deep despair and fear as their faith became embodied with their actions. Perhaps their stories will provide comfort as we struggle with our own despair and fear. God be with us. Praise be to God.